Good morning. So today we do Joseph Stalin. And I want to make you the argument that Joseph Stalin is probably the greatest man who ever lived, okay, for three reasons. The first reason is that Joseph Stalin, he is a poor high school dropout from Georgia, which is on the fringes of the Russian Empire. And he leads an extreme, fringe, and despised political party called the Bolsheviks into absolute power in Russia. Okay, that's the first reason. Second reason is that among the Bolsheviks, Stalin is the least impressive. Everyone else is intellectual with many books, many speeches, many achievements to his resume. But Stalin defeats them all and becomes the ultimate ruler of Soviet Russia. That's the second reason. And the third reason is during World War II, Soviet Union was up against Germany. So Stalin took a poor, divided, isolated nation and defeated Germany and turned it into a global hegemon. All right, so these are the three main reasons why I consider Stalin to be certainly the greatest man of the 20th century, and quite possibly you can make the argument that he was the greatest man who ever lived, okay? So let me reframe what I just said in a different way so it's clearer to you. The Bolsheviks should not have triumphed, okay? If you just looked at what's going on in the early 20th century in Russia, you would not have predicted that the Soviets would have won. Stalin should not become Soviet leader, and the Soviets should not have won World War II, all right? All these three things happened because Stalin willed this reality into being. He is what Friedrich Nietzsche would call the Übermensch. The Übermensch is someone who steps outside of history and warps it to his will. Okay, that is Joseph Stalin. And that is the argument I will make to you today. All right, so some basic history about Russia. As we discussed previously about Russia, Russia is very much a nation with a split personality. It is both Asian as well as European, both Christian and pagan, both enlightened as well as reactionary. And because of these contradictions, it leads to many rebellions and revolutions throughout Russian history. One of the most famous being 1825, a group of military officers called the Decembrists tried to overthrow the Tsar and install a military dictatorship. Ever since this event, the revolutionary discussion becomes sort of like a national pastime in Russia. Dostoevsky, both Dostoevsky and Tolstoy were sympathetic to revolutions. 1853 to 1856 is a pivotal moment in Europe, in Russian history, because that's when Russia loses the Crimean War to the Ottoman Empire, backed by the French and the British. And this marks a limit to the expansion of Russia. So one way that Russia resolves its internal contradictions and its internal conflicts is by expanding eastwards and allowing the nobles to accumulate more land, more slaves, and that mollifies a lot of these nobles. But in 1853 and 1856, after Russia loses the Crimean War, Russia understands that it is backward and agricultural compared with Europe. So Alexander II, who is Tsar of Russia at this time, he embarks on a series of radical liberal reforms. The most major being, in 1861, he emancipates the serfs. The serfs are slaves who are tied down to the land. And by liberating them, he hopes to further industrialize Russia as well as create a more vibrant market economy, which is what you need to be a modern nation state. But as you can imagine, this creates a lot of pushback from the nobles who lose a lot of wealth and property because of these reforms. A fun fact about Alexander II was he was very good friends with Abraham Lincoln. In fact, Alexander II was a huge admirer of the American Republic, so much so that when in 1861 the American Civil War started, Tsar Alexander II was worried that the French and the British would intervene on behalf of the Confederacy. And the reason why is that, first of all, the American Confederacy provides a lot of cotton to the British and the French for their textile industry. As well, the French and the British see America as a growing threat. So by supporting the Confederacy, they believe that they can divide and weaken America. So in response, Alexander II publicly stated that if the French and the British ever declare an alliance with the Confederacy, then Russia would intervene on behalf of the Union. And to show that he was serious, he sent warships to New York and San Francisco to show that Russia would defend America. So this is forgotten, but this is a really fun fact about Russian history, that Alexander II was a huge admirer of Abraham Lincoln. They wrote letters to each other, and he did much to save the American Union in a time of crisis. Now, in 1881, his liberal reforms stopped when he was assassinated. This was he was assassinated on the day that he returned from a meeting where he was going to promote constitutional monarchy in Russia. And then he was assassinated by a terrorist group called the People's Will. Now, there's a very good reason why the People's Will assassinated Alexander II. At this time in Russian history, there were a lot of revolutionaries who believed that to liberate Russia, you need to liberate the mindset of the peasants. The problem is the mindset loved the Tsar. And so the intellectuals felt that the idea of the Tsar enslaved the peasants from seeking enlightenment and freedom. And therefore, to send a signal to liberate the peasantry, you needed to kill the Tsar in an act of violence. And that's what happened in 1881. So this is the People's Will. And what you will see is that they're a very small group of people. There's at most 2,000. And they were founded right before they assassinated Alexander II, 1879. And after the assassination, all the major members were quickly arrested by the secret police and executed. And they confessed to their crimes. That's why we know so much about them. But this creates a problem. The problem is this. If the secret police were so effective in capturing all the assassins right after the assassination, why weren't they effective in stopping the assassination? That's a curious question. In fact, if you think about some more, you have some other problems. For example, the People's Will, it is a terrorist organization. But where do they get the funding? All right, this is always a problem when you are an underground organization. Where do you get your financing from? Another problem is if these are religious fanatics, they really believe that their mission is to liberate the peasantry, they're probably very opinionated, and it's probably very hard to organize them into a hierarchy. All right, so these are two major problems that the People's Will and other terrorist organizations throughout Russian history will face, including the Bolsheviks. Now, to answer both questions, let's do a thought experiment. Let's just say you're secret police, okay, and you're tasked with monitoring and capturing these terrorists. Now, is it to your benefit to capture them, or is it to your benefit to assist them? All right. Now, this sounds like a silly question, but let's think about it deeply. All right. So, why don't you want to support political extremists? Well, there's some very good reasons. It's risky, it's violent, it's unethical, it doesn't really help anyone. Okay. So, we should not help political extremists. But if you're secret police and you ask yourself, what are the benefits of helping them? It turns out there's quite a lot. All right? Let's go over them. Number one, by helping extremists, you defame the entire political opposition. Right? You make all the people who oppose the Tsar look bad because, look, these are fanatical, they're violent. Okay? That's one really good reason why you want to support extremists. Second is, you want to foment internal dissent among political opponents. Okay, so the classic example is the Marxist group at this time in history are the Mensheviks. And they are intellectuals and they believe heavily in Marx. The Bolsheviks are led by Lenin, and they are an extreme group. The main conflict is the Mensheviks believe that for the revolution to happen, you have to follow Marxist prescription, which is you go from an autocracy to a bourgeoisie democracy, because that is what's going to help Russia industrialize. Once industrialization happens, capitalism will automatically make the proletariat class conscious. And when they're class conscious, they will unite and overthrow the bourgeoisie democracy to create the dictatorship of the proletariat, okay? That is the classical Marx theory of evolution towards a communist society. Lenin believed, no, we don't need this, okay? Because the Menshevik worldview is we have to be patient, we have to wait for Russia to industrialize. Right now, the industrial workers in Russia is about 3% of the population, okay? The peasantry is 80%. And Lenin's argument is we don't have to wait for the proletariat to become 80% of the population. What we can do is create a vanguard party and lead the peasants into communist paradise, okay? And the Mensheviks say, well, if you do that, all you're doing is creating a peasant revolution, which will lead to a dictatorship of the peasantry, okay? You'll be no different from the Tsar, all right? So eventually Lenin and the Bolsheviks will split apart from the Mensheviks, okay? And it would be to the benefit of secret police to support the Bolsheviks, right? And we'll see evidence for this later on. By supporting political extremism, you also induce political violence to justify more state control, right? You collect intelligence by implanting spies within these extremist groups. You can also arrest extremists to score political points within the bureaucracy, right? Because the secret police is getting paid a lot of money. How do they justify their salaries? Well, they arrest extremists that they support, okay? Also, you can use these extremists to assassinate political enemies. All right, so you can make the argument that within the secret police, there's a faction of nobles who were outraged at the reforms of Alexander II, especially the thought of creating a constitutional monarchy which would limit the powers of the aristocracy. And therefore, they had the people's will kill Alexander II. You also had false flag operations where you have extremists on behalf of your enemy create terrorist events within the country which will justify a war against an enemy, okay? And also, like the best reason, of course, is because it's fun and exciting, all right? The people in the secret police, they're all psychopaths, and they enjoy this process, okay? In fact, you can make the argument that one of the main functions of the secret police is to create problems for society so that they can justify their power, all right? So again, this sounds pretty extreme to you, but let's look at some evidence that this was the case in Russia in the late 19th century. All right, so this is Vladimir Lenin, and he was a revolutionary who had to escape to Europe in order to not be captured by the secret police, okay? And again, he was a fanatic. So let's read from Wikipedia about his time in London. Lenin's factionalism began to alienate increasing numbers of Bolsheviks, including his former close supporters, okay? So this guy was an asshole. He was a fanatic. He was extreme. He was violent. No one liked this guy. And normally what would happen is he becomes ostracized. He becomes alienated. He is thrown aside, and he's left to write his own books, okay? Which would happen in a normal course of events. But at this time in history, the secret police intervened. The Okhrana, which is the Russian imperial secret police, exploited his factional attitude by sending a spy, Roman Malanskovsky, to act as a vocal Lenin supporter within the party. Various Bolsheviks expressed their suspicions about Malanskovsky to Lenin, although it's unclear if the latter was aware of the spy's duplicity. It is possible that he used Malanskovsky to feed false information to the Okhrana. Okay, do you understand? The secret police was an active supporter of Vladimir Lenin. Now, the Wikipedia tells us that, okay, well, the Okhrana sent a spy to support Lenin, but we can also guess that the secret police were also sending money to Lenin, which is very important, right? Because now Lenin can support his faction within the larger socialist movement. In fact, they probably have more money than the other groups, okay? So the secret police is incubating the Bolsheviks. All right, let's use another example. Have you ever asked yourself where Islamic extremism comes from? So when we did the Islamic Golden Age, what I said, and what I still believe today, is Islamists the Islamic Golden Age was a period of openness and tolerance. So what changed? Well, after World War II, the Americans and the British started to sponsor Islamic extremism. Okay, this is pretty well known historically. Why? There are three main reasons why. The first reason is, at this time in history, the Soviet Union and America was fighting a Cold War. There were no Islamic minorities within America, but guess what? There were lots and lots of Islamic minorities within the Soviet Union. Okay, in fact, it was maybe like a third of the population. That's a lot. And they hated the communists because the communists were atheists, and they wanted to celebrate their religion. Okay, so by sponsoring Islamic extremism, you are destabilizing the Soviet Union. Okay, that's the first really good reason. Second reason is, at this time, the Middle East is growing in importance because of its oil resource, right? Well, at this time in history, the 50s, 60s, 70s, nationalism, terrorism, and socialism are the major ideologies of these nations at this time. And these are all threats to American, British commercial interests within the Middle East, right? Because all these ideologies are saying, like, we shouldn't give our oil for free to America and Britain. We should protect our resource. So by supporting Islamic extremism, you're undermining these ideologies, which is exactly what happened in Iran. Right? And the last reason is the Americans and the British heavily support the Saudi regime, which is extremely unpopular. So a long time ago, the Saudis made a pact with Wahhabism, which is a fanatical ideology within Islam. And so by supporting Islamic extremism, you support Wahhabism, which supports the Saudi regime. Okay? So I want you guys to remember this. The secret police, throughout history, they've been supporting political extremists in order to achieve short-term political objectives. Okay? All right, let's continue. So after the death of Alexander II, his son, Alexander III, comes into power. And he is a reactionary. But he dies fairly young, which leaves his son, Nicholas II, to take the throne. And Nicholas II, he's very young and he's very inexperienced. He's a nice guy, he loves his family, but he's not really equipped to lead Russia in a time of tremendous political and social tumult. 1904, the Russians lose the war against the Japanese. And at this time, not only do they lose the war, but there's famine going on throughout Russia. So this is a time of tremendous discontent and revolution in Russia, which leads to something called the Bloody Sunday in 1905, where worker protesters were killed by soldiers. All right. Also at this time, what's happening is that the royal family, they start to ally themselves with a priest named Gregory Rasputin. All right. If he looks scary, it's because this is a very scary man. He styles himself as a mystic. And the royal family, they have exactly one heir to the throne, and his name is Alexei, the young son. The problem with Alexei is he has something called hemophilia, which means that if he bleeds, he could die. And Rasputin was very good at calming down Alexei. So Rasputin became a member of the royal family, essentially. But people, the Russian people, hated Rasputin because there's rumors that he was like a sex maniac, and he was organizing all these satanic rituals. Also, there was a very popular rumor that Rasputin was sleeping with Alexandra, okay, the Tsarina. And eventually, the nobles will organize and assassinate Rasputin, but not before this entire affair does tremendous damage to the reputation and prestige of the royal family. World War I breaks out, and even though Rasputin pleaded with the Tsar not to intervene, the Tsar did declare war against Germany, and now Russia is up against Germany, the Austrian-Hungarian Empire, as well as the Ottoman Empire. And this war is devastating for Russia. And in 1917, there's a huge spontaneous protest against the Tsar. And at this point, his generals tell him he should abdicate, which is what he does. And so now the parliament, called the Duma, becomes the provisional government, and they declare a republic. All right? But they're still at war with Germany. So what Germany does is it organizes Lenin to be smuggled back into Russia so that he can foment discontent and rebellion and revolution. Okay, so so Lenin was not just a useful idiot to the Russian secret police, but he was also a useful idiot to the Germans who wanted to knock Russia out of the war. When Lenin returned to Russia, he tried to organize a rebellion against the provisional government because the provisional government still wanted to stay in the war, and Lenin wanted to take Russia out of the war. Lenin called for three things, okay? Land, peace, and bread. And this was very popular among the people. Eventually, the provisional government tried to arrest Lenin. He escaped. But then what happened was the military tried to overthrow the government, and now the provisional government under Kerensky now requires Lenin to help out and defend the republic against the military. And Lenin is not in any way a politician. He's a theoretician, okay? And he's fanatical. So let's read a passage from his book, State and Revolution, which he wrote at the time in 1917 to understand his thinking. He says, the petty bourgeoisie Democrats, he's talking about the provisional government, those sham socialists, the Mensheviks, who replaced the class struggle by dreams of class harmony, even picture the socialist transformation in a dreamy fashion, not as the overthrow of the rule of the exploiting class, but as the peaceful submission of the minority to the majority, which has become aware of its aims. Okay? So Lenin has absolute contempt for all of his enemies, a violent, visceral contempt. All right, so in 1917, October, Lenin orders a coup d'etat against the provisional government. And this will eventually lead to something called the Russian Civil War. And at this time in history, the Bolsheviks are controlling only some small cities, primarily Petrograd, but their enemies called the Whites, okay? The Whites are former remnants of the Russian Empire, the aristocrats, the military. They control most of Russia, and it seems like they're making a huge advance against the Bolsheviks, okay? But there are three things that will conspire to ensure the Bolsheviks win. The first thing is the Whites don't actually have a policy for reform. They don't have, they want things to stay the way they are. And peasants are hungry, they're landless, they want peace. Okay? So they lose the support of the peasants. That's the first problem. Second thing is the Bolsheviks will enact a reign of terror. Okay? They have the secret police called the Cheka, which goes around and kills all enemies of the revolution. All right? So they are fanatically instilling fear and terror among the Russian people. The last reason, the most important reason, is Leon Trotsky. Leon Trotsky organizes the Red Army. And Leon Trotsky is an incredible orator as well as organizer. He is absolutely ruthless. He organizes something called blocking divisions. So the idea is when you go into battle, you're supposed to run ahead. If you change your mind and you run back, someone at the back called a blocker will shoot you to death, okay? So it is brutal, but it works very effectively. Also, Leon Trotsky reorganizes the Red Army into a meritocracy. So he doesn't care about your political affiliation. He doesn't care whether or not you support the Bolsheviks. If you're capable, you'll be promoted within the Red Army. Okay? So he turns the Red Army into a very effective fighting force. And this was what allows the Bolsheviks to eventually triumph. Okay? So in many ways, the French Revolution and the Russian Revolution are very similar. All right, so let's go over the similarities. In both, you have a poet, okay? Jean-Jacques Rousseau said freedom is general will. Marx said freedom is classlessness. Then you have a prophet who leads everyone into the promised land through his pure faith as well as fanaticism, okay? So in the French Revolution, you had Robespierre, who said reason will set us free. Within the Russian Revolution, you have Lenin, who said violence will set us free. And the last thing, which we'll focus on in this class, is then you have a Messiah figure who comes and conquers the world to ensure the revolution succeeds. In the French Revolution, you had Napoleon, right, who said, I'm the expanding empire, okay? So his theory to ensure the revolution will survive is to expand outwards and conquer Europe, which is what he did. But then you have Stalin, who is, I'm the continuous revolution. So the way that he maintains the stability and the vitality of the revolution is by constantly purging his enemies, okay? Very much along the lines of the Cultural Revolution in China. All right, so let's look at the similarities between Lenin and Robespierre, okay? Both are from the lower nobility. They're both poets in many ways. And their families faced downward mobility. So Lenin's father was an educator and member of the lower nobility. But Lenin's father died when he was young, okay? So Lenin, and then Lenin's brother, who Lenin really admired, he was arrested while he was at university for plotting against the empire, and he was executed, okay? But both are idealists. They sought to create justice in a world of injustice. Now, the similarities between Napoleon and Stalin are also really interesting. They're both from marginalized minorities. Napoleon was Corsican, Stalin was Georgian, and they felt persecution and inadequacy, okay? And so they became obsessed with obtaining power to escape their insecurities, right? So the similarities between these characters are very, very enlightening for us. All right, so now we focus on Stalin, all right? The background of Stalin is this. His father owned a small shoe factory when Stalin was born, but then the father lost the factory and became an abusive alcoholic. Stalin was born poor, and he did well in school. He had a very loving Christian mother. He did well in school, but in high school he came in contact with Marxism, and then he dropped out. Okay, so the fact that Stalin was a young man who suffered racial discrimination, downward mobility, and an alcoholic father made him the perfect recruit for three types of organizations: criminal networks, revolutionaries, and the secret police. And guess what, guys? He was part of all three networks. And it was a nexus of these three networks within Georgia. Okay? All right. So this is Stalin, and he came from a very poor family, and eventually he will rise to the